Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. As you settle into rest, imagine a time when night arrived without warning lights or glowing screens. In that world, safety did not come from technology. It came from habits so familiar that people barely thought about them. The sun would lower itself slowly. Shadows would stretch across familiar ground. And people, long before modern locks or alarms, would begin preparing for darkness in quiet, practical ways. This is not a story of fear. It is a story of routine, of small actions repeated each evening, of ordinary people making sure that when night arrived, their homes felt held and complete. You do not need to picture danger right away. Most nights were calm. The goal was not to expect trouble, but to be ready for the absence of daylight. Protection, in the past, often meant something very simple. It meant paying attention. In early communities, homes were not isolated structures. They were part of a shared space. Villages grew close together. Walls were built not only to keep things out, but to keep people close. At night, distance felt larger. Sounds traveled differently. The lack of light changed familiar paths. So the first layer of protection came from how homes were placed beside one another. Doors faced inward toward courtyards. Windows were small and carefully positioned. People could hear each other breathing through thin walls. This closeness created reassurance. Inside the home, night preparation followed a rhythm learned from childhood. Fires were adjusted rather than extinguished. A small glow was often kept alive, not for warmth alone, but for orientation. Darkness without any light could feel disorienting. Even a single ember made the space feel known. People understood their homes through touch as much as sight. Hands knew where door frames were. Feet remembered uneven floors. Night protection began with knowing the space well enough to move through it without panic. Doors were important, but they were not the solid barriers we imagine today. Many were made of wood held together with simple fastenings. Bars, larches, and heavy beams were common. They did not promise absolute security. They promised delay. That delay mattered. It gave the household time to wake, time to respond, time to call out. Protection was often measured in moments rather than guarantees. Windows, where they existed, were treated carefully. Shutters were closed early. Cloths or animal hide might be stretched across openings. This was not only about intruders. It was about wind, animals, and the feeling of exposure. Night air could be unpredictable. Keeping it out helped maintain calm inside. A sealed home felt quieter. Stillness itself became a form of safety. Animals played an unexpected role in nighttime. Protection. Dogs, of course, are the obvious example. Their senses extended beyond human awareness. They reacted to sounds too faint to notice. But even livestock contributed. Unusual movement among animals could signal disturbance. People listened for these signs. They did not need alarms. They had patterns. And when patterns broke, attention followed. Sleep itself was different. It was lighter. People woke more easily. They expected interruptions. This was not exhausting in the way we might assume. It was simply normal. Night protection included being ready to wake. Beds were placed strategically. Tools might be kept nearby, not for violence, but for readiness. A staff, a simple blade, a lantern wick waiting to be lit. Community responsibility extended beyond individual homes. Night watchers existed in many cultures. Their role was not to patrol aggressively. It was to observe, to listen, to call out the hours. The sound of a human voice moving through the darkness reassured those trying to sleep. It reminded them that someone was awake, that night was being noticed. This awareness reduced fear more effectively than force ever could. Silence was meaningful. A quiet night suggested order. Homes that settled into predictable sounds felt secure. The creak of wood cooling, the soft breathing of family members, the distant steps of a watchman. These sounds blended into a pattern that signaled safety. People learned to recognize when something did not belong. Protection relied on familiarity rather than constant alertness. As night deepened, most households reached a point of trust. Doors were checked one last time. Fires were lowered further. The home entered its sleeping state. Protection did not end. It simply became passive. Awareness remained, but effort faded. This balance allowed rest without fear. In the quiet that followed, homes stood not as fortresses, but as lived-in spaces shaped by habit. They were protected by routine, by listening, by shared responsibility. And as we continue, we will move closer to how these practices changed across places and centuries, adapting to new materials, growing towns, and shifting ideas of safety. As the night continued, protection became quieter and more internal. The outside world faded. Attention turned inward, toward the household itself. People trusted that what had been set in place would hold through the dark hours. They did not expect perfection. They expected familiarity. Within the home, responsibility was often shared without being discussed. Older members slept closer to doors. Children slept deeper inside. This arrangement was not spoken aloud as strategy. It simply made sense. Those most able to wake quickly were placed where interruption would reach them first. Protection was woven into sleeping arrangements. Not announced as a rule, night clothing mattered more than we might assume. People often slept partially dressed, not out of fear, but practicality. Cold air could shift suddenly. An unexpected sound might require stepping outside. Being ready reduced confusion. It shortened the distance between sleep and response. Fire management remained central throughout the night. A fire left too strong risked danger. A fire left too weak risked darkness. So embers were arranged carefully. Ash was pulled across glowing coals. This slowed burning and preserved heat. It also reduced sparks. The hearth was both comfort and responsibility. Managing it was one of the most important nighttime protections a household could perform. Light sources were simple but deliberate. A single oil lamp might be kept nearby, unlit. Its presence alone was reassuring. People knew exactly where it was. They could reach it without looking. This knowledge reduced panic if something disturbed the night. Darkness was not feared when it was understood. Sound remained a primary signal. Homes were quiet, but not silent. Total silence often felt wrong. It meant isolation. Soft, expected noise confirmed normality. A crack in the wood, a cough, the shifting of animals nearby. These sounds anchored people to their environment. They helped define what belonged and what did not. Outside, streets emptied gradually. There was rarely a sharp moment when day ended and night began. Activity slowed in stages. Late conversations faded. Footsteps became less frequent. Eventually, only necessary movement remained. This gradual transition helped the mind accept darkness without alarm. In some places, shared gates or barriers marked the edge of communal space. These were closed at night not to trap people in, but to define boundaries. A boundary made their night feel smaller, contained. It reduced the sense that anything could arrive from anywhere. Knowing where night began helped people rest within it. Animals were brought closer to homes after dark, not only for protection from predators, but for proximity. Their presence added warmth and sound. They were part of the nighttime environment. A sudden reaction from an animal carried meaning. People trusted these reactions more than their own half-sleeping senses. Illness and vulnerability were considered during night preparation. Those who were weak or unwell were positioned where help could reach them quickly. Night protection was not only about external threat, it was also about caring for the body when it was least alert. A protected home was one that could respond to internal needs as easily as external ones. Weather shaped nightly routines as well. Wind required extra securing of shutters. Rain changed how sound traveled. Cold demanded closer sleeping arrangements. People adjusted each evening based on conditions. Protection was flexible. It responded to the world rather than resisting it. Importantly, fear was not the dominant emotion of night. Respect was. People respected darkness for its unpredictability, but they did not treat it as an enemy. Night was expected to pass. Morning was assumed. This expectation allowed calm preparation rather than anxious defense. Before sleep fully claimed a household, there was often a final pause, a moment of listening, a check of the fire, a hand resting briefly against a doorbeam. These actions marked closure. They signaled that the home was ready. Once this moment passed, effort softened. Sleep arrived in layers. Some drifted quickly. Others remained lightly aware. Protection did not require constant vigilance. It relied on patterns already set. As communities grew and materials changed, these simple practices began to shift. New ideas about privacy, ownership, and danger slowly reshaped how people thought about protecting what was theirs. In the next stretch, we will begin to see how growth and complexity altered the quiet balance between rest and readiness. As the deepest hours of night settled in, protection became almost invisible. Nothing new was added. Nothing dramatic occurred. The home simply continued doing what it had been prepared to do. This was the most important stage. Not the locking of doors or the lowering of fires, but the sustained calm that followed. A protected home was one that allowed the body to rest without constant interruption. People trusted the systems they had built. They trusted the habits passed down through generations. Sleep moved in gentle cycles. It was not one long, heavy descent. People drifted, surfaced, and drifted again. A distant sound might open an eye briefly. Recognition would follow. then rest would return. This rhythm was not considered broken sleep. It was simply sleep shaped by awareness, dreams mixed with familiar sounds. The creak of beams became part of imagined landscapes. Wind outside blended into thought. Because these sounds were expected, they did not provoke alarm. The mind, like the home itself, knew what belonged. Protection at this hour depended almost entirely on predictability. If nothing changed suddenly, there was no reason to wake fully. Homes that remained steady through the night felt alive in a quiet way. They breathed. They settled. They cooled and warmed slowly. Occasionally, something would disturb this balance. An animal might react. A shout might echo from a distance. In those moments, the household responded without panic. People rose slowly. Light was introduced carefully. Voices were kept low. Even urgency was controlled. Protection did not mean chaos. It meant measured response. Most nights, however, passed without incident. And this was the expectation. Night was not viewed as a constant threat. It was a daily condition, like weather. Something to adapt to rather than defeat. As morning approached, the work of protection quietly concluded. Light returned gradually. Sounds increased. Doors opened again. The same structures that had enclosed the household now released it back into shared space. Protection faded back into routine. What matters most in looking at these practices is how little they relied on force. There were no elaborate defenses for most people, no complex mechanisms. Instead, safety came from familiarity, proximity, and repetition. People protected their homes by understanding them deeply, by listening, by placing trust in patterns rather than constant vigilance. Over time, these ideas would change. As towns grew larger, as wealth accumulated unevenly, as distance between people increased, night began to feel different. New concerns emerged. New solutions followed. But at the core, the desire remained the same: to rest without fear, to feel held while unconscious. We will move gently forward. We will begin to explore how growing settlements and expanding cities slowly altered the relationship between people, their homes, and the night itself. As the story continues, it helps to remember the quiet balance of earlier nights. Homes resting close together, doors secured more by habit than by force. People sleeping lightly, listening without strain. This calm foundation did not disappear. But as settlements grew larger, it began to stretch. When villages became towns, distance entered daily life. Neighbors were no longer always within arm's reach. Paths lengthened. Streets widened. Darkness found more places to gather. With this change, protection slowly shifted from shared familiarity toward organized structure. Towns introduced complexity. More people meant more movement. More movement meant more uncertainty at night. Not danger in a constant sense, but unpredictability. People began to notice that they no longer recognized every sound. Footsteps could belong to strangers. Voices carried from farther away. This did not immediately create fear, but it encouraged adjustment. One of the earliest changes was the strengthening of boundaries. Town walls became more defined. Gates gained importance. Closing a gate at night was a powerful act. It did not make a place perfectly safe. It made it finite. The night felt smaller when its edges were known. Gatekeeping became a role rather than a habit. Someone was assigned to remain awake, not to challenge everyone, but to observe transitions. Who entered? Who left? Who arrived late? This awareness created continuity between day and night. The town did not simply go to sleep. It changed its posture. Within these towns, homes adapted as well. Doors became heavier. Locks grew more deliberate. Still simple by modern standards, but more intentional. Keys were not common for everyone. Many relied on bars and braces. Again, the goal was delay, not impenetrability. Windows were treated with increasing care. As houses stacked closer together, privacy became more valued. Shutters closed earlier. Upper windows were preferred for airflow. Lower openings were reduced. Light at night was managed carefully. Too much invited attention. Too little created confusion. People learned to balance visibility and concealment without naming it a strategy. Sound changed meaning in towns. In villages, quiet meant peace. In towns, complete silence could feel unsettling. A distant call from a watchman reassured sleepers. The sound of footsteps on stone reminded people that night was being observed. These signals allowed residents to release responsibility without losing awareness. Inside the home, routines adjusted subtly. Furniture placement mattered more. Doors between rooms gained importance. Sleeping spaces were arranged to reduce unnecessary movement at night. Protection became about managing flow. Where sound traveled, where light reached, where response would be quickest if needed. Fire regulations appeared in many growing towns. Open flames posed greater risk when buildings were close together. Night protection increasingly focused on preventing accidents rather than deterring intrusion. Rules about extinguishing fires were introduced. Buckets were kept nearby. Communal wells were protected. These measures reflected a shift in understanding. The greatest threat at night was often not other people, but fire spreading unseen. This awareness shaped how people slept. Someone often remained partially awake in larger households, not as a guard, but as a caretaker of the environment. Checking embers, listening for unusual quiet, responding to smells before they became visible danger. Protection expanded to include the town itself, not just the individual home. Social expectations reinforced these habits. People noticed who was attentive and who was careless. Reputation mattered. A household that caused disturbance at night gained quiet disapproval. Order was maintained as much by shared values as by rules. Despite these changes, the emotional tone of night remained measured. People did not rush to meet darkness with tension. They adjusted slowly. Protection evolved alongside daily life. It did not replace rest. It made rest possible under new conditions. As towns continued to grow, and as wealth began to concentrate unevenly, new concerns quietly entered the night. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, as difference became more visible in the dark. In the next section, we will drift toward these shifts, and how they influenced both architecture and attitude after sunset. As nights passed within growing towns, protection continued to settle into quieter forms. There was less reliance on instinct alone, more reliance on structure. Not rigid structure, but layered habits shaped by experience. Houses began to show clearer distinctions between public and private space. The area closest to the street was treated differently after sunset. Doors facing outward were secured earlier. Rooms deeper inside the home became places of rest. This inward movement mirrored the emotional shift of night itself. Life retreated gently from open space into contained warmth. Stairways gained importance. In multi-level homes, they were not only routes of movement, they were points of pause. At night, their sounds carried meaning. A step taken slowly felt familiar. A step taken quickly invited attention. People learned these differences without naming them. Locks continued to improve, but slowly. Metal was expensive. Craftsmanship took time. Many households still relied on wooden mechanisms. A thick beam slid into place. A peg dropped into a hole. These actions were tactile and grounding. They reassured through physical engagement. The hand remembered the weight of security. Lighting inside the home became more controlled. In denser areas, light spilling through windows could attract curiosity. People learned to shade openings carefully. Cloth, parchment, or treated hide softened the glow. This allowed enough light to orient the household without announcing its presence to the street. Protection included discretion. Nighttime movement within towns was increasingly regulated. Curfews appeared in some places, not always enforced strictly, but understood. Fewer people moving at night meant clearer expectations. Anything unusual stood out more easily. This reduced the need for constant vigilance. Sound again played a central role. Town watch calls became rhythmic, predictable. Hearing the hours spoken aloud anchored people in time. It reminded them that night was progressing as expected. This awareness was calming. Time itself became a form of protection. Within households, conversations before sleep grew quieter. Not out of fear, but consideration. Walls were thin. Sound traveled. Respect for neighbors extended into the night. A quiet town was not silent, but coordinated. Windows overlooking streets were often avoided for sleeping. Families preferred interior rooms. This reduced sudden exposure to noise or light. It also reflected a growing sense of personal space. Sleep was becoming more private. Protection followed this shift. Storage of valuable items changed as well. Chests were placed deeper inside homes. Not hidden in secret places, but positioned away from entry points. Again, this was about delay and deterrence, not absolute prevention. Children learned nighttime rules early. They understood when not to open doors, when to remain still, when to listen for familiar sounds. These lessons were gentle. They were part of growing up, not responses to fear. Health continued to influence nighttime arrangements. Elderly family members slept where access was easiest. Those prone to illness were monitored more closely. Night protection included readiness to help without disruption. Even as towns grew, many nights remained peaceful. Protection routines faded into the background of daily life. People did not think of themselves as defending their homes. They thought of themselves as settling in. As wealth differences became more visible, however, homes began to vary more dramatically. Some grew larger, some gained more separation from neighbors. This physical distance subtly changed how night was experienced. And with that distance came new ideas about vulnerability and control. We would gently move toward how social change reshaped the quiet logic of nighttime protection. As towns continued to expand, the feeling of night shifted again, almost imperceptibly. Space increased for some households. Homes pulled slightly away from one another. Courtyards widened. Walls thickened. This distance brought comfort in the day, but at night it required adjustment. When fewer sounds traveled between homes, people listened differently. Silence no longer always meant peace. It could also mean separation. Households learned to create their own internal sense of rhythm. Small noises inside the home became more important. A fire settling, footsteps above, breathing nearby. These sounds replaced the shared village chorus of earlier times. Protection began to feel more individual, not isolated, but contained. Families relied less on immediate neighbors and more on the strength of their own routines. Doors were checked more than once. Shutters were tested by hand. These actions were not expressions of fear. They were confirmations. A way of saying that the home was complete for the night. In wealthier areas, materials slowly changed expectations. Stone replaced wood. Iron fittings became more common. These materials felt permanent. They suggested endurance. But they also encouraged a new relationship with security. When barriers felt stronger, attention sometimes softened. Trust shifted from awareness to construction. This shift was gradual and uneven. Most people still depended on habit more than hardware. Locks could fail. Walls could crack. What remained reliable was attention, listening, responding calmly, knowing when a sound belonged and when it did not. Nighttime roles continued to exist beyond the home. Town watch systems adapted to larger areas. Routes were planned. Calls were spaced. The voice in the dark still mattered. Even when heard faintly, it reassured. Someone was awake. Someone was noticing. Inside homes, sleep patterns remained flexible. People woke briefly and returned to rest without concern. They trusted that interruption did not always mean danger. This trust preserved calm. Without it, night would have become exhausting. Children absorbed these attitudes naturally. They learned that night required care, not alarm. That protection was quiet work. That rest and readiness could coexist. As dawn approached, homes transitioned back toward openness. Bars were lifted. Shutters loosened. The night posture of the home softened. Protection receded into memory until evening returned. By the end of this stage in history, a subtle change had taken hold. Night was no longer experienced entirely as a shared condition. It was becoming something managed household by household. This change would continue. It would influence how people thought about privacy, ownership, and safety. We will move further forward, toward periods where separation increased and new fears quietly entered the night, reshaping how people imagined protection while they slept. Before moving further, it helps to rest briefly in what has already formed. Homes once clustered closely. Night was shared. Protection relied on listening, routine, and familiarity. As towns grew, distance appeared. Boundaries became clearer. Night slowly shifted from a communal condition to something experienced more privately. With this shift came new expectations. People began to think of the home as a separate unit that needed to hold itself together after dark, not in isolation from others, but with clearer edges. These edges shaped how night was prepared for and understood. In many regions, This period brought changes in architecture that quietly altered nighttime protection. Walls grew thicker, rooms became more specialized. The idea of a single shared sleeping space slowly gave way to multiple rooms with distinct purposes. This separation changed how sound moved through the house. It also changed how people listened. When sound traveled less freely, attention became more focused, and noise no longer blended into a general background. It stood alone. People learned to identify it more carefully. Was it the house settling? The wind shifting? Someone turning in there? Sleep. This careful listening required calm. Fear would only confuse the signal. Doors inside the home began to matter more. Not just the outer door, but the doors between rooms. Closing a door at night created a sense of containment. It defined where sleep belonged. It reduced unnecessary movement. It also slowed sound, which could be comforting. Night preparation became slightly longer, still unhurried, still routine, but more detailed. Each door was checked, each opening acknowledged. This process was grounding. It marked the transition from day thinking to night thinking. Lighting followed this same inward movement. Homes used less light overall, but placed it more deliberately. A lamp near a sleeping area, a candle positioned where it could be reached easily. Light was no longer about visibility alone. It was about orientation, knowing where you were if you woke suddenly. As homes became more self-contained, the role of neighbors shifted. They were still important, but less immediate. Assistance would come, but not instantly. This awareness encouraged households to rely on their own readiness. First, again, not fear. Preparation. Tools kept at hand reflected this mindset. They were practical. A walking stick, a sturdy object, something familiar to the hand, not weapons in the dramatic sense, extensions of daily life. Sleep itself continued to be lighter than modern rest. People expected to wake briefly. They did. Not fight this. They allowed awareness to drift in and out. This flexibility preserved energy. It prevented the body from remaining tense all night. Children learned to understand these patterns without explanation. They sensed when night had settled fully. They recognized the quieter tone of voices, the slower pace. Night protection was taught through atmosphere rather than instruction. Weather still played a strong role. A storm altered everything. Wind, against shudders, demanded reassurance. Rain on roofs masked other sounds. People adjusted expectations on such nights. They listened differently. They accepted uncertainty as temporary. In these more separated homes, the idea of privacy grew stronger. Privacy at night meant control over who could see and hear you. Curtains, shutters, and room placement supported this. Protection and privacy began to overlap. Feeling unseen helped people rest. Despite these changes, most nights remained calm. Protection rarely needed to be tested. Its success lay in its quiet continuity. Night passed. Morning returned. As societies continued to change, new ideas about ownership and risk would slowly reshape how people thought about safety after dark. These ideas would not arrive suddenly. They would settle in gradually, like night itself. In the next section, we will drift further into this transition, where comfort and concern began to balance in new ways. As households adjusted to greater separation, Protection became more intentional without becoming tense. People accepted that night required a slightly different mindset than day, not sharper, just slower and more attentive. The home at night was treated as a closed system. Air moved in controlled ways. Light was limited and softened. Sound was allowed, but observed. These conditions helped the body relax while keeping the mind loosely aware. Furniture placement reflected this thinking. Heavy pieces were positioned near entry points, not as barriers, but as anchors. They made the space feel solid. They also changed how sound traveled. A door opening would no longer sound empty. It would meet resistance. Floors became important indicators. In wooden homes, the language of creaks was well understood. Each board had its own voice. People knew which sounds belonged to the house itself. Anything unfamiliar stood out clearly. This knowledge reduced fear. When you know what belongs, you do not imagine threats. Sleeping arrangements continued to follow quiet logic. Those who woke easily slept closer to outer spaces. Those who slept deeply were placed farther in. This was not enforced. It was simply repeated. Night after night, habit formed protection. In some regions, household animals slept indoors or very close to entrances. Their reactions were trusted more than human instincts have for sleep. A calm animal allowed deeper rest. An unsettled one brought gentle attention. Night clothing remained practical. Layers were kept nearby. Shoes were placed within reach. This reduced confusion if movement was needed. Preparation removed urgency. Lighting tools became more refined. Lanterns replaced open flames in many homes. They were safer and easier to control. This reduced one of the most common nighttime dangers: fire. Protection increasingly focused on preventing harm rather than responding to it outside the home. The rhythm of towns continued to shape nighttime experience. Watch routes adjusted. 2 new neighborhoods. Cars traveled differently through varied streets. People learned which voices they would hear and when. This predictability allowed rest to deepen. Social trust played a strong role. People knew who lived nearby. They recognized footsteps and patterns of movement. Even when they did not know everyone personally, they understood the flow of night activity. This familiarity reduced suspicion. Illness and age again shaped protection. Those who needed help were positioned thoughtfully. Care at night was part of household safety. A home that could respond gently to internal needs felt secure. Despite increasing complexity, fear remained minimal for most people. Night was respected, not dreaded. Protection was built into daily life so thoroughly that it rarely demanded thought, as material wealth increased unevenly. However, some households began to experience night differently. Larger homes created more space to manage, more doors, more windows, more responsibility. This complexity subtly changed the emotional reminding of night. We will continue drifting forward, toward a time when size, wealth, and separation quietly altered how protection was imagined and practiced after dark. As homes grew larger and more varied, night gained new texture. More rooms meant more quiet. More quiet meant more listening. Protection became less about watching the outside world and more about managing space within. Large homes introduced distance between sleepers. Voices did not travel as easily. This changed how people thought about reassurance. A call from one room might not reach another, so new habits formed. Doors were left slightly open. Lights were placed where they could be seen from a distance. These small adjustments helped maintain connection through darkness. With increased size came increased responsibility. Each window needed attention. Each entrance required routine. Night preparation took longer, but remained unhurried. People did not rush to finish. They allowed the process itself to create calm. Wealth also altered materials. Glass appeared more often in windows. This changed how light behaved at night. It reminded people that visibility worked both ways. Curtains became essential. Protection now included managing what could be seen from outside. Locks improved further. Metal keys became more common among certain households. The sound of a lock turning became part of the night ritual. It marked a clear transition. The house was now closed. Yet even with stronger barriers, people did not abandon awareness. They understood that material alone was not enough. A locked door still required listening. A shuttered window still required attention. Protection remained a partnership between structure and habit. Nighttime roles within the household continued to remind flexibly. Someone often remained semi-aware longer than others. Not assigned, simply inclined. This quiet presence anchored the night. Outside, communities adapted to these changes slowly. Watt systems expanded. Lighting appeared in certain streets. Torches were placed at intersections. These were not meant to brighten the night fully. They were markers, points of orientation. Light at night changed behavior. It reduced uncertainty. It also introduced new shadows. People adjusted their expectations accordingly. Protection evolved in response, not resistance. By the end of this stage, night had become more layered, private, managed, still calm, but more deliberate. People no longer relied solely on closeness. They relied on design, routine, and measured attention. This transition set the foundation for the next developments. As cities grew even larger and social differences sharpened, new concerns would quietly enter the night. We will begin to explore how these shifts influenced both fear and reassurance in subtle, lasting ways. Before moving forward, it is important to settle again into the rhythm that night had taken on by this point in history. Homes were no longer small. Shared shelters clustered tightly together. They had grown in size, complexity, and separation. Night, once experienced collectively, now arrived more privately. And with this privacy came new habits, formed slowly. Without urgency, as cities expanded further, the experience of darkness became layered. Streets no longer emptied all at once. Some areas quieted early. Others remained active longer. People learned these patterns without studying them. They felt them through repetition. Protection depended on understanding when a place usually rested and when it did not. For many households, the evening routine became the most important moment of the day. Not because of fear, but because it created closure. Daytime concerns were set aside deliberately. Tools were put away. Work sounds faded. The home began to change its tone. This emotional transition was essential to nighttime safety. A restless mind was less capable of calm listening. Architecture reflected this shift. Homes increasingly turned inward. Courtyards became favored spaces. They allowed air and light without exposure to the street. At night, these spaces felt contained and familiar. They reduced the sense that darkness was pressing in from all sides. Street-facing rooms were treated differently after sunset. These spaces often became quiet zones rather than sleeping areas. People preferred to rest farther from unpredictable sound. This separation was not dramatic, it was practical. Sleep was easier when interruptions were less likely. Windows gained new significance. Glass was still rare in many places, but coverings improved. Shutters were reinforced. Curtains thickened. People learned that managing light was part of protection. Too much light suggested presence. Too little created disorientation. A soft, controlled glow inside felt safest. Doors followed similar logic. Locks remained simple, but their use became more ritualized. The act of securing a door mattered as much as the mechanism itself. Hands remembered the sequence: bar placed, latch checked, frame touched. These gestures reassured the body that the boundary was complete. Sound awareness evolved further in dense cities. People no longer reacted to every noise. That would have been exhausting. Instead, they learned to recognize layers of sound: the steady background of the city, the passing movement of late travelers, the irregular sounds that did not belong. This mental sorting preserved rest while maintaining awareness. The presence of organized night watch became more noticeable, not because it was loud, but because it was consistent. Calls marked time. Footsteps followed known routes. People learned to expect these signals. Hearing them allowed sleep to deepen. Someone else was awake. Responsibility was shared. Inside the home, protection remained quiet and personal. Furniture placement created subtle barriers. Paths of movement were cleared. Nothing was left where it might cause confusion in the dark. These small adjustments prevented accidents, which were often a greater threat than intrusion. Fire safety became increasingly central to nighttime thinking. In crowded cities, fires spread quickly and silently. Homes adjusted accordingly. Open flames were reduced. Lanterns were shielded. Embers were carefully banked. Buckets and tools were placed where they could be reached without searching. Protection focused on prevention rather than response. Children learned these patterns through atmosphere. Voices softened. Movement slowed. Night had a recognizable feeling. They understood when it was time to rest without being told. Illness, age, and fatigue continued to influence arrangements. Those who needed care slept where assistance could arrive quietly. A protected home was one that could respond gently to its own needs at night. Despite increasing density and complexity, most nights remained uneventful. Protection succeeded by being invisible. When routines held, nothing demanded attention. The city slept in segments, but sleep remained possible as social divisions deepened and populations continued to rise. Night would begin to feel different in different parts of the same city. This unevenness would quietly reshape how people thought about safety after dark. As cities grew denser, night began to feel uneven. Not everywhere at once, but gradually, street by street. Some areas settled early into quiet. Others remained restless longer. People noticed this difference without judging it. They adapted their routines accordingly. In neighborhoods where movement continued late, Households learned patience. Sounds from outside were expected. Voices passing, footsteps that did not stop. These noises were not automatically threatening. They were part of the city breathing. Protection depended on recognizing when movement belonged to this rhythm and when it did not. Homes responded by deepening their inner layers. The outermost rooms became buffers. They absorbed sound and activity from the street. Sleeping spaces moved further inward. This arrangement allowed rest to exist even when the city did not fully sleep. People became more selective about what they listened to. Constant alertness was not sustainable, so attention narrowed. Unfamiliar pauses mattered more than continuous noise. Sudden silence could be more noticeable than sound itself. The mind learned to relax into steady patterns. Lighting practices grew more refined. Instead of one central light, homes used small, controlled sources. A lamp placed low, a candle shielded from drafts. These lights were enough to orient the body without waking it fully. They allowed people to move slowly if needed, without shock or confusion. Privacy became increasingly important at night. Not just visual privacy, but acoustic privacy. People wanted to sleep without being overheard. Curtains thickened. Wall coverings softened sound. These changes reduced vulnerability without increasing isolation. Locks and barriers continued to improve in response to experience rather than fear. If a latch failed once, it was replaced. If a shutter rattled in wind, it was reinforced. Protection evolved through quiet correction. Nothing dramatic, just steady refinement. Inside the home, nighttime roles were rarely assigned. They emerged naturally. Someone stayed awake slightly longer. Someone listened more closely. Someone slept deeply. This balance shifted from night to night. It was flexible, not rigid. Fire safety shaped many of these habits. The knowledge that fire could spread unseen made people cautious, not anxious. Cautious. They smelled the air before sleeping. They felt for heat where it did not belong. These checks became instinctive over time. Children absorbed these behaviors without explanation. They learned that night required gentler movement, quieter voices, slower actions. Protection felt like care rather than defense. In poorer districts, nighttime protection relied even more heavily on routine and awareness. Materials were limited. Space was tight. People depended on knowing their surroundings intimately. Every sound mattered, but not every sound was alarming. Experience taught discernment. In wealthier areas, space increased again. Distance between homes grew. This brought comfort during the day, but required adjustment at night. Households learned to rely less on shared sound and more on internal signals. Dogs, bells, and simple alarms appeared. Not loud, just noticeable. Despite these differences, one idea remained constant. Protection was meant to support rest, not replace it. A home that kept people awake all night was not considered secure. True safety allowed sleep to continue. As cities became more divided socially and spatially, night reflected these divisions quietly. Protection began to vary not just by culture, but by location. Within the same city, as night settled across increasingly divided cities, protection became less uniform. The same darkness touched every street, but it was experienced differently depending on place, space, and circumstance. People sensed this difference without needing to explain it. Night did not feel the same everywhere anymore. In areas where homes were tightly packed and resources limited, protection relied heavily on familiarity. People knew the usual sounds of their street. They recognized the rhythm of late movement, a cart passing too quickly, voices lingering longer than expected. These changes were noticed quietly. Response remained measured. There was no benefit in reacting too fast. Households in these areas depended on cooperation, even when it was unspoken. Neighbors listened for each other. A raised voice brought attention. A sudden disturbance spread awareness naturally. Protection extended beyond walls without formal agreement. It was built from proximity and shared experience. Inside these homes, space was limited, but knowledge was deep. Every corner was known by touch. Every floorboard had a familiar sound. This intimacy reduced fear. Even in darkness, the environment felt understood. People slept with confidence rooted in recognition. In wealthier districts, night felt quieter but more exposed. Distance between homes reduced shared sound. Walls were thicker. Rooms were larger. This quiet required new adjustments. Silence could no longer be interpreted as safety on its own. Households created internal signals to replace what distance removed. Dogs became more common companions. Their presence offered reassurance rather than aggression. A calm animal allowed deeper sleep. An unsettled one invited gentle awareness. This partnership reduced the need for constant listening. Simple alert systems appeared. A bell tied to a door, an object placed to fall if moved. These were not elaborate mechanisms. They were reminders that movement would be noticed. Even the idea of notice was often enough. Lighting outside the home increased slightly in some areas. A lantern by a gate, a torch near an entrance. These lights were not meant to brighten the night. They marked boundaries. They helped people orient themselves if woken suddenly. Orientation remained central to calm response. Within all households, night protection continued to prioritize rest. No one wanted to remain awake without reason. A tired household was less capable the next day. So protection worked best when it faded into the background, when nothing demanded attention. Routines became deeply personal at this stage. Each home developed its own sequence. A final check of doors, a pause in listening, a soft extinguishing of light. These actions told the body that effort could end. Children growing up in this environment learned subtle lessons. They understood that night was not dangerous by default. It simply required care. They learned to move slowly, to listen briefly, to trust familiar patterns. Illness and vulnerability remained central concerns. Night protection was also about ensuring help could come quietly if needed. Homes that could respond gently felt secure. As dawn approached, differences between households softened again. Light returned gradually. Activity resumed. Night practices receded until evening came again. Protection dissolved back into habit. By this point in history, night had become something shaped by social structure as much as by darkness itself. Protection reflected not only architecture and routine, but inequality, distance, and expectation. These changes would continue to evolve, shaping how future generations understood safety after dark. In the next part, we will move further forward into periods where formal systems and new technologies began to reshape nighttime protection, slowly changing the balance between human awareness and mechanical assistance. Before moving ahead, it is useful to rest briefly in what night has become by this stage. Cities are larger now. Homes are more varied. Some are close together. Others stand apart. Protection is no longer shaped only by habit and listening, but also by systems that extend beyond the household as populations increased. Informal awareness was no longer enough on its own. Too many people moved through the same spaces. Too many streets existed to be remembered individually. Night required coordination. This did not arrive suddenly. It developed slowly as a response to scale. One of the most noticeable changes was the formalization of nighttime roles. Watch systems became more structured. Routes were planned carefully. Shifts were assigned. Responsibilities were defined. This organization did not replace household protection. It supported it. The presence of an organized watch allowed homes to relax further into rest, not because danger disappeared, but because awareness was shared. People no longer felt that they alone were responsible for noticing everything. Someone else was awake by design. This knowledge softened the edge of night. Calls announcing the hour became more standardized. They were calm, predictable. They marked time rather than warning. Hearing them reassured sleepers that the night was progressing normally. Time itself became a comfort. With these systems in place, homes adjusted their own routines slightly. Doors were still checked. Fires were still managed carefully. But the emotional weight of responsibility lightened. Protection felt distributed rather than concentrated. Lighting outside the home increased in certain areas. Not everywhere. Only where movement was expected. Street lanterns appeared at intersections, near gates, along important routes. These lights did not erase darkness. They interrupted it gently. The presence of light changed how people behaved at night. Movement became slower and more deliberate. Shadows were clearer. Surprises were fewer. Protection improved not because of brightness, but because orientation improved. Inside the home, lighting practices adapted in response. People relied less on constant light. They trusted that outside markers would help if they needed to step out. This reduced fire risk. Safety improved through subtraction rather than addition. Locks and keys became more common in certain regions. Key ownership carried meaning. It represented responsibility and trust. Keys were kept carefully. Their presence changed the ritual of night preparation. Turning a key marked a clear boundary. Still, mechanical protection never stood alone. People understood its limits. A lock could fail. A lantern could extinguish. Awareness remained essential. Listening did not disappear. It became calmer. Sound in the night changed again. With organized systems in place, unexpected noise stood out more clearly. People learned to trust the baseline of normal activity. Anything outside that baseline invited attention. This clarity reduced anxiety. Homes also adjusted internally. Hallways were kept clear. Steps were memorized. Furniture placement reduced confusion. Accidents at night were still a concern. Protection continued to mean preventing harm, not just responding to intrusion. Children growing up during this period absorbed a different understanding of night. They learned that systems existed beyond the home, that safety was shared by the community. This knowledge reduced fear without removing caution. Illness, age, and vulnerability continued to shape nighttime care. Formal systems did not replace personal responsibility. They supported it. A protected home remained attentive to its own needs first. Despite these changes, night remained mostly quiet. Systems worked best when they were unobtrusive, when nothing called attention to itself, when sleep could continue uninterrupted. As time moved forward, these formal systems would grow more complex. New tools would appear, new expectations would form, and gradually, the balance between human awareness and mechanical assistance would begin to shift. We will continue drifting into this change, where protection became increasingly mediated by objects rather than habits alone. As formal systems became more familiar, people began to rely on them in quiet, subtle ways. Not with blind trust, but with acceptance. The night no longer felt entirely personal. It felt supervised in a gentle sense. This supervision changed how households thought about responsibility. They still prepared their homes carefully, but the feeling of standing alone against the night softened. Someone else was listening to. Someone else would notice patterns beyond the walls of the home. Because of this, nighttime routines shortened slightly, not rushed, just lighter. Doors were secured with confidence. Fires were banked with less tension. The body understood that attention was shared. Street lighting continued to spread, though unevenly. Only certain roads received lamps. Main routes, market streets, approaches to gates. This selective lighting-shaped movement. People avoided unlit paths unless necessary. Protection was supported by predictability. These lights changed the sound of night as well. Where light appeared, movement slowed. Footsteps became clearer. Shadows were easier to interpret. The mind no longer had to imagine what it could not see. This reduced strain. Inside homes, darkness was allowed to deepen. People slept with less light than before. They trusted the external markers to guide them if they woke. This reduced fire hazards significantly. Many homes became safer by using fewer flames at night. Locks and keys became more standardized. Craftsmen produced similar mechanisms. People learned how they felt, how they sounded. The familiarity of the mechanism mattered. A lock you understood was more reassuring than a complex one you did not. Keys were kept in consistent places, often within reach of the bed, not because of fear, because habit reduces confusion. Night protection favored clarity over speed. Sound awareness continued to adapt. With watch systems in place, certain sounds lost their urgency. A distant call no longer startled sleepers. It reassured them. Unexpected silence sometimes drew more attention than noise. Households learned to distinguish between local sounds and distant ones. This skill developed naturally. Over time, the city gained a recognizable nighttime voice. When that voice changed, people noticed. Furniture placement and interior layout continued to matter. In larger homes, corridors were kept uncluttered. Stairs were memorized by feel. Protection included preventing injury in darkness. A fall at night could be more dangerous than an intruder. Animals remained part of nighttime protection. Dogs in particular adapted well to these systems. They reacted not to every sound, but to changes in pattern. Their calm presence allowed deeper rest for humans. Children growing up during this period absorbed a blended understanding of safety. They learned that protection came from both the home and the outside world, from routine and from structure. This balanced view reduced anxiety. In poorer districts, formal systems did not remove the need for personal vigilance. Lighting was limited. Watch coverage was thinner. Here, habit and familiarity remained primary. People depended on each other quietly. Protection stayed communal, even as systems expanded. In wealthier areas, reliance on systems grew more noticeable. Homes were larger. Distance from neighbors increased. Mechanical assistance helped fill the gap created by space. But even here, people understood that devices did not replace attention. Illness, age, and vulnerability continued to guide nighttime arrangements. Formal protection did not override care. A home still needed to respond to its own internal needs gently. Most nights passed without interruption. This was considered success. Protection that announced itself too loudly was seen as a failure. True safety was quiet. As systems became more complex, new tools would slowly enter the home itself. Objects designed specifically to notice, to signal, to warn. These changes would further shift how people related to night. As mechanical assistance slowly moved closer to the home, night took on a slightly different character. Protection was no longer only something that existed outside, on the street, or within shared systems. It began to enter private space in quiet, practical forms. Not dramatically, almost without comment. Households started to incorporate simple devices meant to notice rather than confront. A bell attached to a door. A loose object placed so it would fall if disturbed. These tools did not act on their own. They waited. Their value came from the sound they made if something changed. Even the possibility of sound mattered. This shift changed how people slept, not in obvious ways, but subtly. Knowing that movement would announce itself allowed the mind to release some attention. Sleep could deepen without becoming careless. Protection supported rest rather than interrupting it. These early alert tools were intentionally simple. People trusted what they could see, touch, and understand. A bell either rang or it did not. An object either moved or stayed still. There was no mystery. Clarity reduced anxiety. Lighting inside homes continued to decrease during sleep. People relied more on orientation than illumination. If woken, they reached for a familiar lamp. If sound occurred, they listened first. Immediate reaction was rarely necessary. Protection favored assessment over urgency. Doors and windows became more clearly defined boundaries, not just physical, but psychological. Once secured, they allowed the mind to let go. People did not repeatedly check them through the night. That would defeat the purpose of preparation. Trust in routine mattered. The role of animals remained steady. Dogs adapted easily to these changes. They learned which sounds belonged to normal systems and which did not. Their reactions became more precise. A sudden alert from a calm animal carried meaning. A relaxed one signaled safety. In many homes, the presence of these layered protections changed the tone of night entirely. Darkness felt less like an unknown space and more like a managed condition. Still unpredictable, but not overwhelming. Children growing up with these tools learned a different lesson than earlier generations. They learned that night could be noticed without being watched constantly, that safety could exist quietly in the background. This understanding shaped how they rested. Despite these changes, human awareness remained central. No device was trusted completely. People still listened. they still recognized patterns. Mechanical assistance supported these instincts rather than replacing them. In areas where resources were limited, such tools were often improvised. A string tied across a doorway, a container balanced near an entrance. These solutions reflected creativity rather than fear. Protection was shaped by available materials, not by ideology. In wealthier households, devices became slightly more refined. But even then, simplicity remained valued. Overcomplicated systems were viewed with suspicion. If something failed silently, it was useless. Sound and clarity remained essential. Nighttime routines adjusted again. The final moments before sleep included checking these small signals. Not obsessively, briefly. Once confirmed, attention softened. Effort ended, illness, age, and vulnerability continued to influence how these tools were used. Devices were placed where they would not startle unnecessarily. Care remained gentle. Protection was not meant to disturb those who needed rest most. By the end of this period, nighttime protection had become layered. Habit, architecture, community systems, simple mechanical notice. Each layer reduced the burden on the others. Together, they allowed night to remain what it had always been meant to be, a time for rest. As time moved forward, these mechanical ideas would continue to evolve. They would grow more complex, quieter, less visible. And with that evolution, the relationship between people and night would shift once more. In the next part, we will move into this transition, where protection began to operate almost invisibly, and night grew calmer, but also more distant from human senses.